This is the saddest story I've ever heard. We had known the Ashburnhams for 9 seasons of the town of Nauheim with an extreme intimacy, or rather, with an acquaintanceship as loose and as easy, and yet as close as a good gloves with your hand. My wife and I knew Captain and Mrs. Ashburnham as well as it was possible to know anybody, and yet, in another sense, we knew nothing at all about them. This is, I believe, a state of things only possible with English people, of whom, till today, when I sit down to puzzle out what I knew of this sad affair, I knew nothing whatever. 6 months ago, I had never been to England, and certainly I had never sounded the depths of an English heart. I knew only the shadows. I don't mean to say that we were not acquainted with many English people, living, as we perforce lived, in Europe, and being, as we perforce were, leisured Americans, which is as much as to say as that we were un-American. We were thrown very much into the society of the nicer English. Paris, you see, was our home. Somewhere between Nice and Bordiga provided yearly winter quarters for us, and Nauheim always received us from July to September. You will gather from this statement that one of us had, as the saying is, a heart, and from the statement that my wife is dead, and she was the sufferer. Captain Ashburnham also had a heart, but whereas a yearly month or so at Nauheim tuned him up to exactly the right pitch of the rest of the 12 months, the 2 month or so was only just enough to keep poor Florence alive from year to year. The reason for his heart was approximately polo, or too much hard sportsmanship in his youth. The reason for poor Florence's broken years was a storm at sea upon our first crossing to Europe, and the immediate reasons for our imprisonment in that continent were doctor's orders. They said that even the short channel crossing might well kill the poor thing. You may well ask why I write, and yet my reasons are quite many. For it is not unusual in human beings who have witnessed the sack of a city or the falling to pieces of a people to desire to set down what they have witnessed for the benefit of unknown heirs or of generations infinitely remote, or, if you please, just to get the side of it out of their heads. Someone has once said that the death of a mouse from cancer is the whole sack of Rome by the Goths, and I swear to you that the breaking up of our little four-square coterie was such another unthinkable event. Supposing that you should come across us sitting together at one of the little tables in front of the clubhouse, let us say at Homburg, taking tea of an afternoon and watching the miniature golf, you would have said that, as human affairs go, we were an extraordinary safe castle. We were, if you will, one of those tall ships with the white sails upon a blue sea, one of those things that seem the proudest and safest of all the beautiful and safe things that God has permitted the mind of men to frame. Where better could one take refuge? Where better? What I'd like to talk to you about today is start to think about the idea of the narrator and of narrative voice. And we're going to shift away from what we've been talking about previously, where we've talked about poetry, and I'd like to have a little bit of a think about prose. When you join us in September, your first prose study is Margaret Atwood's A Handmaid's Tale, and it's a very interesting place to start from a narrative point of view. In that story, the narrative voice is what's called homodiegetic, which means that not only is the novel written in the first person, but it is the point of view of a character intrinsic to the story itself. And we'll think why that becomes significant in a moment. So what I would like to do today is firstly make a slightly shorter video, because the last one was like 20 minutes and it was about the English Civil War. And what I'd like to do today is just to pose to you a series of questions that you might ask yourself when reading a text. The questions today, I suppose, will be most useful when you look at a prose text written in the first person, but some of them are obviously still applicable as well to third person narratives. The phrase that I always like to use here, and the phrase that I'll always come back to, is aspects of narrative. When we think about how is a story told to us, how is an idea communicated? And the aspects of narrative are different depending on the text type. So narrative techniques we might find in poetry, we don't necessarily find in prose, and then we don't necessarily find in drama text as well. So just thinking about prose today, and hopefully you've already got a book on the go and you can consider some of these things as well. So just a very short walkthrough today of some questions that you might care to ask yourself. And what I'm going to do is just have a look at them this way. So here are some thoughts about questions that you might ask yourself. And I want to talk specifically about the placement of the narrator. The example I'm going to use in a moment is from Ford Madox Ford's The Good Soldier. Again, I feel like you're going to get used to me saying this a lot in September. I love this book. I love a lot of things, but I particularly love Ford Madox Ford. And it's very interesting to think about the placement of narrator in this sense, because this is the very opening chapter of the book. And so we are starting completely afresh. One of the things that we have to remember before we look at some of those questions we might ask ourselves is that the narrator is the central tool of the author. Who tells the story to us, obviously, is completely at the behest, the whim of the author. And the way in which they tell that story is just as significant. But when they're first person, I think that makes it much more interesting. They become a character in their own right. So then what builds is this triangle, and I'm going to come back to this a lot in September as well, but you have this triangle with the reader, the narrator, and the author, and it takes all three of us to make the story happen. So some questions that you might ask yourself: how does the narrator relate to the events of the story? So we've come up with this word homodiegetic. And if you're a media student, actually diegetic sound is when you can see it on screen. So if you're a media student, that's quite a nice way to remember it. Is this first person or third person? Do we have an omniscient narrator that's able to see and understand and know everything that's happening in the text? Or if we have our first person homodiegetic narrator, how is their placement in the story affecting how we learn about those events, which events we learn about? We also might think about this question: what is their proximity to the action? So a really interesting example of this, and if you haven't read it, I recommend it to you, is F. Scott Fitzgerald's The Great Gatsby. The narrator in The Great Gatsby is a man called Nick Carraway, who lives in the house next door to Gatsby. So in that central timeline of the story, he's able to tell us things as they happen, as they exist to him. But Gatsby, I don't want to give too much away here because it's a pretty important aspect of the plot, has a whole back history that Nick Carraway knew nothing of, because he's only met him in the present of the book, as it were. So we might think about, do they directly observe the events of the story? Are they retelling somebody else's story as it's retold to them? Another great example of that is the nested narrative of the Gothic genre, things like Wuthering Heights and Frankenstein. We might also think about the proximity of the narrator in terms of their role with the central characters. Are they an antagonist? Are we being told the story by, and we would never use this word at A-level, but I'm going to use it now, the baddie? Or are they the protagonist? Are we hearing firsthand a character's journey from the character themselves? And this kind of sits into the third question that you might ask yourself: how much does your narrator know? Now, it's not a given when you have a first person narrative that they are completely privy to every aspect of the story. There are things that they will know about a particular character, and there are things that they will know about themselves. But when they observe the action, or when events are unfolded to us, they can't know everything. So we might think about, how do they learn what's happening? How significant is time here as well? We'll see this in a moment, but why Ford Madox Ford's introduction in The Good Soldier is such a good example is because we want to think about their emotional relationship to the story. So an excellent version of this, an excellent example of this, would be Humbert Humbert in Nabokov's Lolita. The very opening lines of Lolita are a scorching love poem from Humbert Humbert to Dolores. And so it becomes very clear from the very beginning that this is a story that is absolutely obscured by lust and by desire. And it's the same in Ford Madox Ford's. The opening sentence of the story is, "This is the saddest story I've ever heard." More of that in a moment. The final question I want you to ask yourself when you're reading a book, when you're reading prose, is how reliable is your narrator? And an interesting way to think about this is, why are they telling us this story? Again, if we have the narrator as sort of the side observer, Lolita a good example, F. Scott Fitzgerald a good example, Goodbye to Berlin by Christopher Irving, maybe. It's definitely called Goodbye to Berlin. He describes himself in the beginning as a camera, and he's just kind of passively taking the pictures. But we learn as the story goes on, he has an incredible investment in the characters that take place there. So the unreliable narrator, what affects our reliability, our memory, our perspective, how much of the story we know, which viewpoint the narrator is telling it from. If they're telling a story to us retrospectively, which they often are, then what's happened along the way that affects how reliably they might tell us. So this is a good moment, you can pause me in a moment, to write down these questions just to have them in your head. I'm also going to now look at just the opening paragraph of the story. So a good activity that you might want to think about doing is, I've emailed with the link to this video, just the opening few paragraphs from the same story, from The Good Soldier. And you might want to carry on this analysis of what's affecting things with these stories, with these questions, sorry, as you go along. So let's have a look then at the opening paragraph. The question I want us to have in our heads is, how does the author use the narrator to tell the story? And we're going to use those prompt questions I just went through to help. So now if we look at it again, different meanings and different phrases and words will become more significant to us. And this is just as I've been trying to explain it with the poetry. How does my understanding of one thing illuminate, change, manipulate, exaggerate my understanding of something else? So now, if we think about what's the significance of the narrator's emotional relationship to the story, the phrase is, "This is the saddest story I've ever heard. Extreme intimacy, sad affair, sounded to the depths of an English heart," tell us that the narrator is incredibly invested emotionally in this story, that they not only have this intimate knowledge of these characters that they're describing, but their retelling the story is mired in sadness. The second thing that you might pick out then is the use of time. And the words that I've highlighted there in purple, we've known the Ashburnhams for 9 seasons, for 9 years. He is writing today, so we have this then sense of timeline, the present moment within the story as well. 6 months ago, I had never been to England. So then we know that 6 months ago, he did go to England, having never been there before. And then we learn later on that his wife couldn't have crossed the channel because she had a heart problem. So these clues to do with time, we start to build up in our heads. The author is suggesting to us what period the story takes place over, and then that becomes relevant to us as well. The final aspect that I've highlighted from this paragraph is the sense of reliability. And what you can hopefully see here in blue is when we start to get clues about how reliable the narrator is. Specifically in this example from The Good Soldier, we have a number of striking contradictions. He describes the relationships with the captain and Mrs. Ashburnham as being loose and easy, and yet as close as a glove with your hand. He says, we knew them as well as it's possible to know anybody, and yet we knew none, not at all. And we start to think maybe about hard times. It was A Tale of Two Cities, sorry, a best of times, worst of times. He talks about sitting down to puzzle out the story. And if he's puzzled by it and he's the one telling us, where do we think that will leave us, the reader? So just a quick glance through them at the ways in which we might have a look at different prompt questions within the text, and how we might approach the prose text in that way. And for us to not just open a book and accept that what the narrator is telling us is right and true and accurate. The narrator is a character. And we treat all characters in prose with a certain level of scrutiny. How much do we trust them? How important are they? What do they signify? What do they symbolize? What are their relationships like with others? And what does that tell us about the author's concerns? So hopefully you'll have started to read Handmaid's Tale before September. Double hopefully, you'll already have other books on the go at the same time. And so what I'd like you to do is have a look at what you're reading at the moment and just have those questions outlined in your head and start to scrutinise your narrative voice a little bit more. Again, you're also welcome to have a bit of a think, make any notes or ask any questions about the extract that I've sent you, which is the rest of Ford Maddox Ford. The key thing to take away, and the last thing that I'll share with you today, I didn't really make this video much shorter than the other one, I'm very sorry, is this question. An English literature student reading a text should ask themselves, why am I learning this information in this manner at this point? I know that people make a running joke about English teachers when they say something's blue and the English teacher will go mad because of everything blue signifies, and the author's just like, I wanted it to be blue. But at A level and the types of text we're looking at, we're thinking about the author as the architect, guiding us through a building in a very, very specific way. As always, thank you for your emails that you send me and any questions you have as going along. And I'm always happy to recommend books, go back over anything, or give you a little bit of extra work to do as well. Thank you.